Welcome back to GP2 Enthusiast. Thank you all for 500 subscribers. I truly never thought this channel would get that big, but thank you all for that. So, as tradition with larger coaster channels, they all make their top 10 coasters, so I will do the same. Every channel makes this type of video, but keep in mind, I only have about 60 credits, believe it or not, contrary to what many of you probably believe. Only about 60 credits, only 4 parks. I've got every credit at Cedar Point, every at Kings Island, almost every credit at Carowinds, and Dollywood's was kind of a wash, but I didn't ride Lightning Rod, which is the only important one, but I rode everything else major there. So keep that in mind when you're paying attention to my list here. Some of these picks are quite controversial, but yeah, let's get started.
Raptor rules the sky.
Raptor. This is my favorite B&M invert, and oh my gosh, is this thing good. I do prefer it to both Afterburn and Banshee, and I know a lot of people get a little upset that I prefer it to Afterburn, but this ride is so much more forceful than Afterburn, and the whippiness of the inversions is simply insane. Especially night rides on this thing is insane. I prefer back row to front. I actually found it to be smoother. It can be a little rough in the front row, and depending on when you ride it and stuff like that. But again, this ride is just so darn good. Really, just get to Cedar Point at night, ride this thing. It's at the front of the park. Everyone else is in the back or they've already left. It has no line. You can stay on in a lot of cases, as I did in a couple of my Cedar Point vlogs this year. It's just such a good ride. And the Cobra roll is so forceful. The various corkscrews, I think it is two, are very, very whippy. And then the only real part I found on the ride to be rough was the final transition into the brakes. Other than that, it is so smooth. And honestly, this ride doesn't get talked about enough. It's my favorite B&M invert. We'll see if that changes next year, as I'll be at some more parks. But right now, it's really up there. Thunderhead. This is the best wooden coaster I've been on. It's not saying a whole lot because I'm really comparing it to Hurler and Mean Streak, although more to Kings Island's Woodies. And I would definitely say I prefer it to any of Kings Island's Woodies. This thing really just flies. The airtime is definitely much stronger. It's a lot more ejector airtime, whereas Mystic is a lot more floater airtime. So I definitely prefer it for that reason, although Mystic can have some ejector. But this thing seemed to be more consistent. Considering I rode this thing in December, just a few months before Mystic Timbers opened, actually, it was really flying then, whereas I rode Mystic Timbers, got off it, and was like, that's it? That was really disappointing when I compared it to Thunderhead. So this is by far just a great GCI, and it's never talked about. And that's kind of sad because this is a really great ride. Super smooth, long ride. Station flyby is awesome. The whole station shakes, and if you don't know about it, it can like scare the GP. They'll jump back when they're getting onto the next train. So it's just a great ride overall, and definitely my favorite at Dollywood. Of course, I didn't ride Lightning Rod, but hey, that might change sometime soon. Anyway, on to number 8. Top Thrill Dragster. This is a ride that when I used to go to Cedar Point as a kid, I would always look at like, why the heck would anyone do that? That's insane. And then I rode it, and I was like, that's insane. Because this ride is insane. It's one of the few coasters that still gets me nervous. I'll be on the lift hill for Steel Vengeance, and I won't be nervous. And we'll get to that ride in a minute. But this, I can be sitting on that launch track and just feel it roll back and know, okay, I've got 6 seconds. And though it's the most tense 6 seconds ever. This is such an insane ride. I've done it front row and middle, never back. Got a few rides on it this year. I would definitely recommend a night ride for this thing. It tends to run better then, and also it's cooler. First ride I ever got on it was actually a night ride fireworks ride. It was such a good ride too, especially when you're towering over the fireworks. Here's how I can sort of describe this thing, especially when it's your first ride. Even if you've watched the POVs, it's still just as insane. So you get to that launch track, you are so scared. Suddenly it launches, And all you know is you remember the start of the launch, you remember being at the end of the launch track, you remember being at the top of the top hat, you remember spiraling down, and you remember being on the brakes. That's all I remembered from my first ride. This thing is insane. And one of the best rides, I don't know if it was the best. I probably prefer my night ride. I did this thing front row in the morning once. That was a great ride, although it wasn't quite as insane because I remembered more of it because you can see more of it. But still, it's insane to be up that high, of course, only for a few seconds. I have seen it roll back. I've never gotten a roll back, but I'd love to sometime. And overall, I just love this ride and try and hit it every time I'm at Cedar Point. But it's not as good as some other coasters that we're coming up on now. Maverick is another Intamin masterpiece at Cedar Point, and this ride was ranked much higher at the start of this season, but I'll tell you why it fell. So my first ride I ever got on this thing, I was just sort of still GP when I first rode it, and I looked at it and I'd ridden, the B&Ms of the park at the time, and I was like, yeah, this thing looks like nothing, this is easy. I also ridden Millennium Force earlier that day too, and I was like, this is nothing. Should we even bother riding this thing, or should we just ride Mean Streak? Because Mean Streak was still there, and I never really disliked Mean Streak. So we get in line for it, and I'm like, it's short and easy, Of course, I don't know about I'm not going to spoil it. Well, I will spoil it, but if you don't know about the spoiler, click off this video now. You'll make the ride much better for yourself. So I get to the ride, go through the first half. I'm like, wow, that is amazing. That was a crazy ride. And we stop in the darkness. I'm like, where did we get? Up to 70 miles an hour again. Loads more airtime in the second half. And it's just an insane ride the first time you ride it. And my original placement of this thing, where it was at number 1, was based on the first time I rode it. But if you watch POVs of this thing and you ride it multiple times, it really just falls and falls and falls. It's still an insane ride no matter how many times you ride it, but it just doesn't have that surprise factor and that just greatness to it that it once did. Also, this year I didn't feel like it was running quite as fast as previous years, but that could just be me. But overall, I still love this ride, and I try to ride it whenever it has a short line, although this year it has had longer lines due to Steel Vengeance. But overall, I still love it. Diamondback is the first hypercoaster on this list, which also means it's my least favorite hypercoaster. However, I do still love this ride. It is my favorite ride at Kings Island, and the airtime is okay. That's sort of where I sort of have it falling out with this ride, because I like to compare it to some other hypers I've been on. The drop on this feels a lot shorter than those other hypers. The airtime in the first half up to the first set of trim brakes, so basically up to that big bank turnaround, is actually really good, especially in the front row. It's like borderline ejector. It's really good. Like that first and second hill are really, really good. Better than you'd expect from a B&M Hyper. And quite intense, honestly. But then after that first set of trim brakes, it really slows down. And that return trip back to the big helix over the basketball game thing and over by Beast, that return trip, those airtime hills hardly give you any airtime. It's sort of, I think it was in the loop described as tummy time, and I kind of have to agree with them there. You just sort of feel a little bit of airtime, but it's not anything real good. So it sort of ranks lower for me. I still do like this ride a lot, especially for that first half. And the splashdown is really cool, and it does look really nice, but I do think Kings Island needs a few more standout big rides, and Diamondback just isn't that for them. However, it's still a good ride, nevertheless.
Welcome to the Intimidator.
Intimidator at Carowinds is the first coaster in my top 5. It is my favorite B&M hypercoaster, and oh my gosh, do I love this thing. The airtime is relentless. It's floater, but there's so much of it that it just never ends. So you start off with this drop, and the drop, I would say, it's more comparable to Fury's drop than it is to Diamondback's. because this drop just feels like it's lasting forever. I went in with it. It also helps the ride that I went in with really low expectations because everyone was like, "Oh, you're gonna hate it. It's got so much pacing issues because of these trim brakes," and I didn't think that was the case at all. I did only ride it back row, which probably did influence it a little bit, and only on a wing seat too. But every ride I got on it, even when you hit the trim brakes, you barely noticed them, and then you just went flying out of your seat. Every single one of those airtime hills, unlike on Diamondback, every single airtime hill on this thing sends you out of your seat. And the whole ride is really good up to that mid-course brake run. Whereas like on Diamondback, you hit the mid-course brake run and, well, you actually have a ride left. On Intimidator, you hit the mid-course brake run and you have a helix. It's a typical Cedar Fair kind of ending, and that is probably the worst part of the ride. I do kind of wish it'd just go, maybe throw in an extra airtime hill and go straight to the brakes. But I understand why they had to do that for capacity and safety with blocks and that sort of stuff. But overall, I do really like this ride, but it's not my favorite hypercoaster. Magnum XL 200 is my favorite hypercoaster. I'm sure that's going to cause a lot of controversy, but let me explain. Last year, I rode this thing and was like, oh, well, that was okay, and a little bit painful. And then this year, I thought about it a little more. I went to Cedar Point in July for the first time of the season. Went a little late this year. And said, all right, I'm going to give it another shot. I gave myself about half an inch of room. And it moved from not even in my top 15 to my number 4. Yeah, this ride is insane. Honestly, I'm debating whether to put it at number 3. It is... So, for those of you who don't know too much about Magnum, or maybe you hear like the Coaster Studios mainstream kind of coaster reviews of it, this ride can be painful. If you get stapled, you will hate it. All the GP who ride it hate it because they staple themselves because they're scared, which just causes like the most funny pain you can ever experience for them. And so what you kind of have to do with this ride is before the ride starts, move your feet kind of closer to the back to the, you know, where you're actually sitting, so that way your knees are up. That way the ride op doesn't staple you. Then take one of your arms, brace it against the seat back, and hold up the lap bar. Keep holding onto that lap bar, and you can hold your other hand in the air if you want. Keep holding onto that lap bar until you get to the airtime alley, which happens after the last turn going back towards the station. There's about 3 airtime hills, or 4 actually, I think. I'll have to rewatch a POV. But those airtime hills are the most powerful airtime I have ever experienced. You leave yourself enough room, you are standing. It is the best airtime on any ride. That includes Steel Vengeance. It is insane. I would definitely recommend any row is really good. If you're kind of scared of the insane airtime, middle tends to be a little less crazy. And the best thing about this ride is because all the GP don't really like it, on less crowded days at Cedar Point, you can pretty much walk onto this thing. And that's just so good and kind of sad. I wish it would get more riders because this thing is so good and it's a great historical value. But I'm not one to really like coasters for historical value, and I also don't really like coasters for their views. However, Magnum is an exception. Magnum, I got multiple rides. In fact, I've gotten most of my rides at night on Magnum. And that's when this thing really shines, because you will go up that lift hill. You look behind you, to your left, to your right. To your left, you see Steel Vengeance off in the distance. You're like, wow, that's an insane ride. To your right, you see all the lights of the Cedar Point main midway. You're like, wow, that's so cool. I'm so glad I'm at Cedar Point. Then you look straight ahead, and all you can see is the blackness of Lake Erie. And then all of a sudden, before you know it, on that long, great, loud aerodynamics classic lift hill, you drop. And the drop on this, I honestly think the drop on this is better than Diamondback. Not better than Intimidator, but definitely better than Diamondback. Pretty good airtime, and then up over that first hill, you'll get some airtime there depending on where you sit. If you're in the back, you really won't get anything, but if you're towards the front, you'll get some. And then you get another pretty good moment of floater / ejector, more ejector than floater, right before that big bow tie turn sort of thing that Arrow made with a coat hanger. I don't really care how it was designed, but seriously, this thing is so good, and it gets way too much hate for being rough. It's not rough. As long as you can handle, like, if you can handle any wooden coaster, this thing's not rough. My advice to you, just go row 3 or back row. Both are great. And honestly, I really love this ride, and I hope it never gets torn down. I can't love this ride anymore. Again, I wish I could put it at number 3, but there's just a few more rides that I like a little bit better. So let's get onto those now.
At the turn of the millennium, there were signs.
Millennium Force is the most overrated yet underrated ride in existence. All the enthusiasts called this thing super overrated, and then it became underrated, but it's still a little overrated by the GP. But still, it's a great ride. A lot of people compliment this thing, if they compliment it at all, for the drop. I really don't see that. I think hypercoasters like Intimidator and even Diamondback have a better drop than this. But the overbank, the first overbank especially, is really forceful, and I gray out on it every time. But then the rest of the ride is really good. You get a great feeling of speed. The airtime is really strong. Not the strongest at Cedar Point, but it's strong. And overall, it's just a really great ride. And honestly, if you don't really like this, well, I'll tell you what happened. So I rode it for the first time when I was still sort of GP. Rode it. I was like, wow, that was insane. What just happened? That was crazy. That was the craziest thing I've ever done. I had Maverick later that day and preferred it, but that's sort of been covered earlier in the video. And then it just sort of fell from that because I was like, oh, Maverick's better. And then, oh, Fury's better. And then I tried it again. And it was actually my first Cedar Point vlog this year where I rode it front row at night. And while I got covered in bugs, it was still one of the best coaster experiences I think I've ever had, if not the best. The flying around and just going over those airtime hills and just getting splatted with bugs is just insane. It doesn't make sense. It hurts so much, but it's so much fun. You can't stop laughing. And yet it's just such a good ride. And I can't say enough positive things about that. If you ride it for the first time, I know one thing I noticed is I flew around dinosaurs alive. I was like, what? There were dinosaurs on that. I was really confused. Of course, now if you're riding it next season, there won't be any dinosaurs. You'll have some weird adventure thing that I still don't know what it is. But still, I really like this ride. And honestly, I think it gets way too much hate, much like Magnum. Just a great ride. And sure, it's not the best steel coaster in the world, but it is still up there. And I think it'll remain in my top 10 for quite a while. Fury 325 is my second favorite coaster. My last two picks are not going to be very controversial compared to the rest of the list, but still, this needs to be talked about. This ride is really good, and honestly, it's starting to become a little underrated because the community overrated it so much. Again, I'm not too big of a fan of the overrated, underrated stuff, but it really does affect some rides negatively. And Fury is one of those rides. A lot of people are like, oh, Millennium Force is better. Oh, there's so many rides that are better. Maverick, a lot of times, decided it's better. I disagree entirely. The drop on this ride is the best drop on any coaster I've ever experienced. Unlike a lot of other rides in this list, the drop just lasts forever. Take Intimidator's drop, except make it bigger. 100 feet bigger. And it is great. It just continues forever. You feel like you're just falling. It's like a drop tower. And then the rest of the ride exists. It's great. It's great. And then, so you go through the first half of the ride, and after you pass over and under the entrance, which is a really cool moment, by the way. You just can't help but scream at all the people walking over you. It's really cool. You go over into the airtime section after the Helix especially, but before the Helix too. A lot of people call this floater airtime, and I don't get that. It's all ejector, although I did ride it mostly in the back. I didn't really ride it in the front, I don't think, so I didn't really get to experience it there. But I think I got 5 rides on it my day at Carowinds, and it was really good. It does not at all feel like a big B&M Hyper. It's so much more forceful and intense than a B&M Hyper. Which is why it's placed at my number 2 spot. I had it at number 1 before the next ride on this list. I really did not expect the airtime on it to be ejector. I expected it to be floater just because it's a B&M. But then I got to those airtime hills and I was flying out of the sea. I was like, what the heck? It's the most similar sensation airtime-wise I can compare it to is Maverick. It's very similar airtime-wise to that, except it has more of it, and the rest of the ride is really crazy. So I really like this thing, and I rode this thing with really, really high expectations. I went into it saying, Maverick was my number 1 at the time, and I was like, yes, all right, this is going to be better than Maverick. And I got off it, and I was like, wow, that's not at all what I expected, but I do like it way better than Maverick. So I really can't say enough good things about Fury 325. One of the best rides of all time, and probably the best B&M out there. Until maybe Kings Island, we'll see. But on to number 1.
They've returned with a menacing and twisted machine so big and brazen, the likes of it had never been seen. The tallest of its kind. The fastest speeds. The wildest maneuvers ever attempted. Upside down. Inside out, sideways, slantways, over and over and over. They're back, and they're here with a Steel Vengeance.
Steel Vengeance is the best roller coaster in the world. Yeah, I'm sure everyone expected this one. What can I say about this ride? It is, call it overrated all you want, it is not. It completely deserves every bit of praise it gets. Trimmed or trimless, I've ridden it both. Trimless is better, but trimmed is still an insane ride. I don't care what you want to say about it. It's still great. It's just not quite as great. I rode this in the rain. It's my best ride I did. Row 4 in the rain with no trims. It was insane. Every time this ride hits the brake run, everyone on the train is clapping. You can't help but laugh or clap when you hit the brake run. That 27 point whatever seconds of airtime that Cedar Point claims it has, it does have every single second of it. I expected the inversions on this ride to be like Maverick, where they're kind of forceless and boring. Whereas, Steel Vengeance, they whip you around. They're almost like Raptor in a lot of ways, except, you're not suspended, so it can't be quite as whippy as Raptor. But it does whip you around quite a bit. They're quite forceful. And when you go through that structure, it's not as good of a near miss as you'll get on some rides that are kind of focused on it, like Gatekeeper. But it's still some pretty good near miss elements. It just doesn't feel quite as crazy, like Fury's near miss elements better, which I didn't even talk about. But, the airtime, again, is just unbelievable. The drop is great. The first half of the ride is great. The second half of the ride, definitely the best airtime is on that drop out of the mid-course, or maybe on a trimless ride it might be the drop out of the brake run, or the mid-course brake run, but on a trimmed ride it's probably right before, on the double up to the brake run. And overall, just an insane ride. There's nothing bad about this ride. There's nothing anyone could do to improve it except keep the trims off all the time, but I understand why they have to run those. Otherwise, this thing would tear itself apart. Those poor upstop wheels, they're probably, ready to fall off. Don't get scared. But, no, seriously, this ride is insane. And the memes that have come with it, too. I'm not even going to start with the hot sauce and the bumping. But, it's just such a crazy ride. It's worth every second you wait for it. Every time I've ridden it this year, it's had at least an hour and a half wait. Most of the time it's been 2 hours, but I've waited multiple times 2 hours in the same day for it. It's totally worth it. It is the perfect ride, and I don't think it would be very, very difficult to build something any better, and I don't think any manufacturer can build anything better other than RMC. But yeah, that's my top 10 coasters. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.